Samantha Lewis was slammed with humiliation the moment she accidentally entered CEO Brandon Aldridge's office, facing outrage and disrespect she never deserved. Brandon's arrogance and quick temper turned a simple mistake into a shocking display of power and bias. But Samantha returned with undeniable proof of her authority, calmly reclaiming control and exposing the truth. Just wait until you see how she turned the tables and why justice ultimately prevailed in this tense, unforgettable showdown. Samantha Lewis strode down the polished marble corridors of Aldrich Enterprises, her heels clicking softly but firmly against the floor. The morning sunlight filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long, sharp shadows across the sleek, minimalist lobby and the walls lined with awards, framed certificates, and glass displays celebrating decades of corporate achievements. Samantha moved with the confidence of someone who had worked years to prove herself, her posture straight, her gaze forward, her mind entirely consumed by the upcoming board meeting. Her thoughts were a whirlwind of numbers, strategy, and presentation slides. She rehearsed the points she needed to make, the objections she might face, and the way she would counter them with clarity and authority. For Samantha, this meeting wasn't just another item on the schedule. It was a chance to make her mark, to assert the value of her vision, and to push initiatives she had spent months developing. Yet, in her concentration, she failed to notice a slight shift in the office layout. A side door she mistook for the conference room entrance. Without a second thought, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was far larger than she expected, lined with dark mahogany shelves and decorated with abstract artwork that seemed to radiate power and authority. Behind the massive desk sat a man whose presence seemed to fill the space before she even registered him, Brandon Aldridge, the CEO of the entire enterprise. His sharp suit, perfectly tailored, his meticulously combed hair, and the expensive watch gleaming under the sunlight were symbols of the status that often made him untouchable in the eyes of the company. Samantha's entrance, meant to be professional and purposeful, seemed to disrupt that perfectly curated environment. Brandon's eyes snapped up, darkening instantly, and his face contorted with surprise that quickly became visible anger. His voice, sharp and booming, cut through the otherwise hushed office. "Get out! How dare you just barge in here? Do you even know who I am?" The words reverberated off the walls, echoing with a force that made Samantha stumble slightly. The tone was not just an assertion of authority, it was an attack. The anger in his voice carried a weight that went beyond the mere fact of intrusion. It was as though Samantha's presence challenged the entire hierarchy of the office, her poise and calm demeanor highlighting a reality he had never prepared to face. The color of her skin, her youth, her quiet confidence, it all seemed to ignite a sense of outrage that was raw and immediate. Samantha froze in place, her hand still hovering by the door handle. Shock washed over her, a mixture of disbelief and the unmistakable sting of disrespect. She had encountered difficult people before, bosses who underestimated her, colleagues who questioned her ability, but never had anyone erupted in such a way for the simple act of entering a room. Her mind raced, trying to grasp what had triggered such hostility, while her body stood rigid, caught between retreat and confrontation. For a moment, the office seemed impossibly large, the air thick with tension. The injustice of the situation was undeniable. She had followed the same protocol as any employee, had not spoken out of turn, and had every reason to be there. Yet, the sheer intensity of Brandon's fury made it clear that her presence, her competence, and her very identity were being challenged. Every second stretched painfully, and Samantha felt the burn of humiliation, but it was laced with a different emotion, a spark that would not be ignored. Anger. Not the blind anger of the moment, but a quiet, simmering fire. A realization that what she was facing was not just a personal insult, it was a barrier, one that had been erected by arrogance and prejudice. She was determined, even in that instant of shock, not to let it define her, not to let the injustice stand unchallenged. As Brandon's gaze bore into her, Samantha's mind hardened. She would not leave this moment with her head bowed or her dignity diminished. Something had shifted within her, an awareness that the confrontation, sudden, unfair, and deeply infuriating, would be the first step toward reclaiming control. In that tense office, the line between victim and victor was already beginning to blur, and Samantha was silently preparing to cross it. The door slammed behind her with a sharp, echoing thud, reverberating through the marble corridor like a judgment she hadn't earned. Samantha Lewis froze for a heartbeat, her hand still resting lightly on the handle, and then slowly released it. The sound seemed to mark the end of any immediate confrontation, but it left an invisible weight pressing against her chest. Her heartbeat quickened, not from fear, but from the sting of humiliation. The hallway, usually a place of purposeful movement and professional exchanges, now felt oppressive, confining, almost accusing. She stepped back, her shoulders rigid, trying to shake off the sudden surge of emotion. Every step she took seemed heavier, as though the polished floor itself were resisting her progress. Around her, colleagues walked by, their eyes darting nervously in her direction. Some whispered under their breath, others avoided even glancing her way. No one intervened. In that moment, the office felt colder, lonelier, and strangely silent, as if the injustice she had just faced had created a barrier between her and everyone else. Samantha's cheeks burned, not from embarrassment, but from the clarity of the moment. The humiliation was sharp, the sting of it immediate, and the unfairness cut deeper than the slammed door. She had entered the office with nothing but purpose, professionalism, and confidence, yet all of that had been met with scorn. Her authority had been invisible, her competence dismissed before she had even spoken. The sense of being underestimated, reduced, or ignored in the very space she deserved to command made her chest tighten. But as the initial shock faded, another realization settled in, heavier and more complex than the anger that had flared in the CEO's office. Brandon Aldridge, the man who wielded authority with confidence and intimidation, had no idea who she truly was, not just because he hadn't recognized her face, but because he had entirely misjudged her position, her role, and her influence. The thought was almost laughable in its irony. The CEO of a multi-million-dollar enterprise had completely failed to recognize that Samantha Lewis was, at that very moment, the acting board chair. Temporarily entrusted with overseeing operations while the board conducted an urgent review, she was not an entry-level assistant, not an intern, not someone to be dismissed out of hand. Pain mixed with disbelief as the truth sank in. How could someone so prominent, so commanding, be so unaware? How could arrogance blind him to reality so completely? Her professional identity had been challenged in an instant, her authority disregarded, and yet, paradoxically, that very dismissal revealed something important: the system's weaknesses, the assumptions that allowed such moments of injustice, and the opportunities they inadvertently created for those prepared to seize them. Samantha's mind raced. She recalled the months of preparation that had brought her to this point, the reports she had compiled, the meetings she had led, the strategic decisions she had navigated with precision. Each step had been deliberate, thoughtful, and purposeful. And yet, all of it could have been overlooked if she allowed a single moment of intimidation to define her. Pain had arrived uninvited, but Samantha realized it could serve a different purpose if she channeled it correctly. It could ignite a sharper focus, an unshakable determination, and a renewed sense of mission. Her cheeks still warmed, her heart still thrummed with the remnants of shock, but Samantha began to straighten her shoulders, inhale deeply, and reclaim the space that had been denied to her. She understood now that the true measure of the encounter wasn't just the humiliation, it was the challenge it represented. Pain had entered the room, yes, but it also illuminated the path forward. What had begun as a rush of anger and disbelief slowly transformed into resolve. She would not leave this moment defeated. She would not allow the injustice to define her. Every ounce of her being braced for the next step. She was ready, not just to return, but to assert herself fully, to ensure that her authority was recognized, and to transform the sting of pain into the fuel for decisive action. This was the turning point, and Samantha Lewis knew it. The hallway was no longer a place of humiliation. It was the prelude to reclamation. Samantha paused just outside Brandon Aldridge's office, the polished wood door standing as both barrier and threshold. Her breath was steady, her steps deliberate. She had felt the sting of humiliation, the weight of disbelief, and the sharp edge of unfairness. But now, all of that had transformed into something far more potent: clarity. The hallway no longer seemed oppressive. It was a stage, and she was ready to take control. She opened the door slowly, deliberately, and stepped in. This time, there was no hesitation, no trace of uncertainty. Her movements were measured, each step a statement of purpose. In her hands, she carried a leather-bound folder, its contents unmistakable proof of authority. Board resolutions, financial reports, and directives that confirmed her role as acting board chair. She did not rush. She did not apologize. She was not there to negotiate recognition. She was there to claim it. "Brandon," she said, her voice calm but firm, resonating with the authority that had previously been overlooked. I think you forgot. Today, I'm in charge." For a brief, suspended moment, the office seemed to hold its breath. Brandon's eyes widened, and for the first time that morning, the arrogance that had filled the room dissolved into something more fragile. His jaw tightened, then slackened, his carefully curated composure cracking under the weight of undeniable fact. The documents slid across the desk between them, and the sound of them settling echoed louder than any words. Every page was a declaration. Samantha's authority was not up for debate, her position not temporary in the sense of uncertainty. It was deliberate, sanctioned, and real. Brandon's gaze flickered from the documents to her, searching for a reaction, a flaw, any indication that she could be dismissed as easily as before. But there was none. Samantha stood straight, her eyes steady, her tone unwavering. The tension in the room shifted palpably, like the sudden tilt of a scale. Where moments ago he had wielded dominance, now he sensed the reversal. He realized that the balance of power had changed, and the realization unsettled him more than any confrontation ever could. The sense of hope that stirred in Samantha was not selfish. It was expansive, almost tangible, reaching beyond the confines of that office. She thought of the employees who had endured subtle slights, who had been ignored or dismissed simply for not fitting a preconceived image of authority. Every moment of bias, every instance of arrogance that had gone unchecked had contributed to an atmosphere of quiet frustration. And now, with one calm, decisive act, Samantha was beginning to reclaim not just her own position, but the narrative for everyone who had ever faced such challenges. Her mind was clear. There was no room for hesitation, no space for doubt. Every word she had rehearsed, every strategic move she had planned, came together seamlessly. She felt the pulse of possibility in the room, the shift in energy from tension and intimidation to recognition and respect. The sense of hope was not naive. It was precise, measured, and backed by authority that could not be contested. Brandon swallowed hard, his earlier outburst reduced to a quiet, tense stare. He realized that this was not a moment for defiance. It was a moment for reckoning. Samantha's composure, her confidence, and the sheer evidence of her role left him little choice but acknowledgment. The air that had been thick with intimidation and hostility now vibrated with potential, an unspoken understanding that the landscape of authority had changed irrevocably. As Samantha placed the folder firmly on the desk, her shoulders squared and her chin lifted, a spark of triumph ignited. She had faced the sting of injustice, endured the sharp edge of disbelief, and now stood at the threshold of transformation. Hope was no longer a distant idea. It was present, alive, and undeniable. She had taken the first step toward reclaiming control, asserting her voice, and reminding everyone in the office, including Brandon Aldridge himself, that true authority was not a matter of ego, but of responsibility, clarity, and courage. In that room, the dynamic had shifted, and Samantha Lewis knew that the journey ahead, while still challenging, had already begun on the right path. The narrative was hers to lead. Within hours of Samantha Lewis asserting her authority, the ripple effects began to unfold. The board of Aldrich Enterprises, alerted by her reports and the official documentation of Brandon Aldrich's behavior, called an emergency meeting. The conference room, usually reserved for quarterly updates and routine discussions, now held a charged atmosphere of scrutiny and accountability. Brandon, once untouchable in his office, found himself summoned, not by circumstance but by the undeniable weight of consequence. Samantha had acted decisively, yet with measured professionalism. Every page she had placed on his desk, every calm word she had spoken, had served as more than proof of her authority. It had illuminated the gaps in leadership and the culture of complacency that had allowed arrogance and dismissiveness to thrive. The board's response was swift and deliberate. Brandon was made aware that his actions, the unchecked outburst, and the blatant disregard for protocol were not only unacceptable, but incompatible with the values the company claimed to uphold. The realization hit him like a sudden, unavoidable truth. Authority without respect is fragile, and unchecked ego has limits. For Samantha, the sense of triumph did not arise from witnessing his discomfort. It came from the restoration of fairness, from seeing the principles of accountability take root in a place that had long been overshadowed by intimidation. She had reclaimed her dignity, yes, but she had also set a precedent. The toxic culture that had lingered beneath the polished exterior of the company had been exposed, and a conversation that had been suppressed for years was finally emerging into the open. By the week's end, Samantha's influence extended beyond the confines of her immediate role. Meetings, once perfunctory and hierarchical, now included candid discussions about respect, professionalism, and accountability. Colleagues, previously hesitant or silent, began speaking up, encouraged by the example she had set. Her leadership style, calm, assertive, and grounded in fairness, became a model for others. The very office that had felt oppressive and intimidating was transforming into a space where integrity mattered as much as authority. Brandon himself, once so confident in his untouchable status, found the experience humbling. The arrogance that had once filled his office with tension was tempered by awareness. He began to recognize that true leadership requires more than a title. It requires respect, listening, and the courage to acknowledge mistakes. Samantha had not only confronted the immediate injustice, but had catalyzed reflection, growth, and accountability at every level. Her colleagues began to see her as a symbol, not just of authority, but of resilience. Samantha Lewis had turned a moment of shock and humiliation into a story of courage and influence. Her journey from being underestimated and dismissed to reclaiming control and guiding the company through a crucial turning point became a beacon. Employees who had once felt powerless now recognized that standing up, speaking up, and acting decisively could reshape not only personal narratives but organizational culture itself. The arc of her story, from initial shock and anger to decisive action, recognition, and ultimate triumph, served as a reminder of a profound truth. No arrogance or prejudice can overpower integrity, professionalism, and courage. Her victory was both personal and collective. It demonstrated that challenges, even those posed by seemingly insurmountable authority, can be met with preparation, composure, and resolve. As the week closed, Samantha reflected on what had transpired. The office, once filled with tension and uncertainty, now held a renewed sense of purpose. Conversations about respect were no longer hypothetical. They were active, alive, and shaping policy and behavior. Brandon, humbled and more aware, was learning the same lesson she had embodied. Leadership is earned, not assumed. Samantha Lewis had not only reclaimed her own authority, she had inspired change, created dialogue, and set an example for courage in the face of injustice. Her story became a testament to the power of standing firm, of confronting inequity with clarity and composure, and of transforming challenges into opportunities for growth. The triumph was not just hers. It was a collective awakening, an affirmation that integrity, fairness, and courage will ultimately prevail.